lot of the people that are a little worried about this referendum and not sure which way to go are concerned that developers might use it for new buildings and that they might be able to extend the size of the structures, and that we're really going to be pushing everything towards this 40-foot. So what you told me this morning was interesting. You said basically in each zone there's a height restriction, and that is going to restrict how big the building is.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So the misconception that I'm hearing that you're telling me about is that somebody could take a single-story house like this and then start adding stories to it and transform it into something like this, and further that they could elevate this 3 feet to get to the base flood elevation and elevate it an additional 4 feet for the freeboard and go from this to this. And that's not possible for a couple of reasons. First of all, every district, every zoning district has its own structure height requirement or limitation. So it's not about how much greater a building I can build as opposed to how high can I elevate this building. So in the Newtown district, where we have a 20-foot height restriction on the building itself.
Is it 20 or 25?
25.
25.
25 feet in the single family district. That 25 foot, the size of the building can't be enlarged. You can't go from 2 to 3 stories because that 25 foot is going to be able to be moved up to a certain degree, but not enlarged.
So for new construction, basically the interpretation is going to be it needs to fit into the code as is without the exemption. You design your building that would fit in that 25-foot area, and then we're going to talk about bringing it up.
Right.
And then we're going to give you the extra
Right.
height on top. So now we're looking at what the base flood elevations are. So I think a lot of people are interested in the single family zones, which are mostly in Newtown, I think. And what are the base flood elevations there? I was trying to look, and I'm seeing 8 and 9. Is that what they mostly are? Do you know what they mostly are?
Yeah, the base flood elevations decrease as you move further inland from the coastline. So if you're in the center of Newtown, then the base flood elevation is usually about 6 feet above sea level. But the ground is usually about 3 foot. So if you have a slab on grade building in Newtown that was built in the 50s, like most of them were, then typically that building is going to be 3 foot below the base flood elevation because the ground is already 3 foot high. So 3 plus 3 puts it at about 6. We'll take this house that's 3 foot below the base flood elevation. Right? So to get to the base flood elevation, we add 3 feet. Right? But under this referendum, you would get an additional 4 foot. And that's a maximum, this 4 foot. It can't go any higher than that. So here we have a single-story residence elevated at the maximum height allowed under this referendum. Now, let's do the same thing, but start with a 2-story structure. So this 2-story structure is...
And is that 25 feet?
It's 27, actually.
27, okay.
Right, because of the peak of the roof.
And that would have been allowed in single family. You're allowed to go a little higher already for non-habitable, like for
Well, it
for
probably
the
was
peak?
grandfathered if it's there now.
Okay, because
Yeah.
there is no such 5 foot for non-habitable in the SF zone.
Well, currently there is a variance that could be obtained for uninhabitable space, like an uninhabited loft or an attic or something like that, or a steeple or something along that lines. So
Okay, so we have a 27-foot house
Right.
here.
And then we take that 27-foot house and we apply the same elevations, the same 3 foot to bring it to the base flood, and the same additional 4 feet to give you some freeboard.
Okay. All of us in planning have switched over to
And there we
new
are.
addresses.
Now normally,
So
this could not
so
be
the
accomplished
first part is
because the
all
height
sort of
restriction is
in,
here.
and then it should be
In
at
theory, you
city
might be able to go
west
get
dash
a
fl
variance.
.gov.
But you wouldn't be able to inhabit that space. This would allow this building to be elevated to the height restriction
I can ask
plus
you, I mean,
the
that
7
should be
feet
working. I can
that
ask
you
you.
needed at the bottom to raise it.
So that's
So-
now 34 feet. Okay, and is there any kind of inventory on
Okay,
the
perfect.
number of
Alright,
houses,
first one is,
or is there anything like that? Like the number of houses in each base flood elevation?
No,
Sort of
the-
area?
no
We-
data exists to say how many buildings are in any particular flood zone.
Okay. All right.
I can tell you though, that in the flood zones, we have 228 repetitive loss properties and severe repetitive loss properties. And they would be the ones to take the best advantage of this because they're the most flooded buildings in the city.
And are those in the single family zoning, or are those really on the coast, even in old?
They're mostly inland. They're in the single family districts in large part.
Hi, this is Kevin in planning.
Okay.
My extension is 3725.
Oh, I wanted to ask you about Old Town, because a lot of
This
people are
one,
concerned
from
about
public,
what's this going to
same
look
thing,
like when
email,
you're in the
error
historic
messages,
district. So I know there's some
when trying to
provisions for
email,
HARC to
um,
come
multiple
in and
staff.
have a say. How does that work in our?
I can use
Well,
city
first of all, in the
US-FL.gov
historic district
email
is
addresses.
the
So,
largest section of the
there
flood
is
zone that's not
some
regulated. It's
info
called the X
copy
zone.
there.
And that's
So
basically the
just wanted to
Solaris
get
Hill
your
area. And
email
if you
from
extended out, for example, along Duval Street, or if you went from Eaton Street
Anyway,
on the lower end of Duval to Virginia Street on the upper end of Duval, that's all in the X zone. And it would be unregulated, so the referendum would have no effect on any buildings in that area, which is the largest part of the historic district. Now, when you got closer to the water, then you're gonna start coming into the flood zones, and they would be regulated. Now, currently, if you have a house below flood in the historic district, and you want to bring it to the flood level, and in this case, we have a 4 foot below flood. So, under existing HARC rules, that's what you can do. If you want to take advantage of the referendum and put in that additional couple of feet for freeboard, that's for what you have to get HARC approval.
And then, does it look like we're going to have scenarios in Old Town where it's going to go up to the point where there would be, you know, it would be going very high and there might be garages and things like that under the houses? Does it look like that might come up in some areas?
I don't know, that's difficult to say. What do you think?
I know that when we looked, I mean, there are pieces of the historic district that are, you know, out of the X zone, but it would still, everything, all of HARC's, what we put in the ordinance, that all, HARC will rewrite its stuff so that even if they are allowed to go up a certain foot, you still mask it, so that you don't, so it doesn't look like you got just underneath parking garage. So that no matter what, that piece of what it looks like in the end still goes under HARC, still needs approval.
Okay, so that's a very valid point, that even if HARC said you could do this, they're gonna have jurisdiction over what this looks like. Right, so,
Okay, so they're going to be able to say, you know, you need to mask it with whatever. And they're going to write guidelines? They don't really have any at this point, right? They're going to
you'd have
be
to ask
writing.
somebody from HARC.
They don't, and that will be a part of the process. So, depending on the outcome of the referendum, then we've got the actual height piece is written, and that was part of it. HARC still would have to come up with the guidelines, and then that goes all the way up to DCA, DEO, and comes back down to us. So it'd be a year process of making sure that it's all vetted.
And there would be no exemptions until all of that LDR
Correct.
stuff and HARC
Yeah.
stuff was done. Okay.
I guess the biggest misnomer is that because there's a 40% cap, and that's probably
40 foot.
a 40-foot, what did I say, percent? There's a 40-foot cap on the maximum height for buildings. We kind of need to retool that message, because what people are absorbing from that is buildings can automatically go to 40 feet.
Right.
And that's not the case.
So in a single family zone, you cannot go ahead and build a 30-foot structure, like 3 stories with a flat roof, stick it in there and take advantage of this.
Can't do it.
You
But that's
can't do
the
it.
perception out there that this would allow that to happen, and that's not a fact.
So what we're doing is we're designing to the current code and then asking for an exemption to bring it up, depending on our base flood elevation, where we are, and we get to add an extra 4 max.
Right. There's 4 foot is a maximum. The only variable here is going to be how high do you need to get to base flood elevation? And typically that's 3 feet.
Typically that's 3 feet. So you would say, like, what percentage of the buildings are going to need to come up 3 feet, as opposed to more than that?
I wish I had the data for that. I can only say that the ones that I deal with every day are along Flagler Avenue, and that part of town are typically 3 feet below flood. If you go into some of the lower lying areas where the repetitive loss properties are, now you're talking where you could be 4 or 5 feet below flood levels.
So let's say 5 feet. So basically, in that scenario, there you could add another 4, and you could be coming up 9 feet. It would be a 25-foot building plus 9 feet, so you'd be at 34 in that situation. But you think mostly we're going to see 3 foot
Those are the properties
in Newtown.
that when we had the insurance reform kick in so adversely last year, those were the calls I was getting from homeowners who were worried about not being able to pay the insurance hikes and not being able to afford to elevate their homes.
Okay, and then for people that have these repetitive losses, is there some kind of government program that's giving them grants to help?
There is FEMA funding available to help elevate these homes, because in FEMA's mindset, if they put money into elevating those homes now, the payoff is much larger in the end, because they won't be paying flood claims one time after another. And this program started because they discovered these repetitive loss properties across the country, in some cases, were paying 2 times the value of the home for repeated loss claims, as opposed to just elevating the home. And they said, why are we doing this? We should be investing in helping people elevate their homes rather than just keep paying flood losses.
Makes sense.
So what's going to happen now under the new FEMA guidelines is that if you have a repetitive loss property and you suffer another flood event, they're going to offer you a mitigation opportunity. And if you fail to take that opportunity, they're going to eliminate your flood insurance. And then you're thrust onto the commercial flood insurance market, which is anywhere from 10 to 20 times more expensive than the National Flood Insurance Program.
What is the federal government doing with their mapping, and what are we doing with our ordinance coming up? How do they interrelate?
Well, currently we have the flood zones which are mapped out for us by FEMA. And if you're in an AE6 flood zone, which is closer to the center of the island because typically it's higher, then if you're going to build a new house, for example, or substantially renovate an old one, and you're required to elevate it, it has to come up to that 6-foot level. And the question then becomes, well, 6 foot above sea level, so where is that? Because you don't know the height of the ground. So that's why we require an elevation certificate, because on that elevation certificate, it will give us the height of ground above sea level, and it'll give us the flood zone. So, okay, it's a 6-foot zone, and the grade is at 3 feet. So we're halfway there. So the house doesn't have to be elevated 6 feet because the ground's already 3 feet above sea level. So we have to ensure that the first finished floor of the house is 3 feet above the ground. And we'll get an elevation certificate when the building is finished, showing that it's at that 6-foot mark at least.
So we should not be alarmed when we look at the FEMA maps and we see these very high numbers. It's not really describing the amount of space that's going to be under this house because the ground is already likely above sea level. And so we've already taken care of some of that just by the terrain of Key West being somewhat above sea level.
We haven't any building lots in the city that are below flood level, or below sea level, I should say. I think the lowest spot that we have that's built up is probably around Front and Simonton Streets, and that's at an elevation of about 2 feet above sea level, and still at floods.
Okay. And you feel like if we have this code written, then FEMA is going to look at our community and that's going to change our rating just because of the way we're allowing people to raise heights and build?
I've already met with the people that would come to Key West and evaluate us and shown them this proposal, and they said they would definitely award points to this because it would provide an opportunity for people to elevate their homes that doesn't exist today. So even if not a single building was elevated under this, just passage gets us extra points. If eventually houses are elevated, then each of those houses will add even additional points.
And so this point system, how far are we as far as points go before we get somewhere where we start seeing some kind of change in our status? We got a long way to go? Or?
There are 10 classifications to this point system, with class 1 being the best, which is a 45% discount on flood insurance policies. That's not going to happen. There's only one community in the entire U.S. that has such a rating. I'm confident we can get a class 8 rating. Presently we're at a 10, which is 0. So when you look at your flood insurance bill at the bottom, it says CRS discount 0. Mm-hmm. We're hoping to change that to 10%. That would raise us 2 classes. And each class is 500 points. And the points get harder as you increase up a class. They're harder to obtain and qualify for. So I'm confident at this point, within a year, we should be able to get a 2-class increase, 5% per class for a 10% discount. But we also have an excess number of points that puts us within striking distance of a class 7 rating, which would be a 15% discount.
And so every homeowner in Key West is going to see a 15% discount?
Well, everybody that has a flood insurance policy.